This is an interview with Marian Wauda, November 2nd, 1978, and we're at Marian's home on Bond Street in Neenah. All right, Marian, why don't we just start talking about your ancestors as much as you will. What would you like to say about your ancestors, grandparents? You said that your ancestors go way back to the Huguenots in France. Is that
Right.
right?
The ancestors on my maternal side, and when they first came to this country after Louis
Excuse
the...
me.
Uh,
Let me just say one thing. There's a story. Marian has a pamphlet here on her ancestors, and for any historians who are interested, it's the pamphlet or magazine is called the Winchester Academy, and it's the bicentennial issue, 1976, and the article is entitled "The Motts of Winchester, Wisconsin" by Robert Mott. And Robert is your brother, is that
twin
right?
brother.
Twin brother.
Right.
So anybody who would like to refer to more to the history of Marian's paternal side, right?
Right.
Could refer to that article. That's how we try to avoid what's already been printed.
Very good. Very good.
What are some of the stories that perhaps have come down about your family, or recollections that perhaps aren't printed somewhere? Are there any?
My mother, as I said to you earlier, my own mother, who passed away when I was just a child, was one of 5 children whose parents came from Denmark. And I remember my grandmother and grandfather Holmes with great affection.
And what was her name?
Her name was Emma Holmes.
Emma Holmes.
And she had served as a secretary in my father's law office. That's how he met her, and subsequently married her. And at any rate, I have very, very faint recollections of her because I was only 3 when she died. But when her mother and father came across the ocean from Denmark to the United States, and grandmother was so ill from seasickness in the boat that for many, many years after that she wouldn't even get in a rowboat on the Fox River. But she dearly loved the water, and she loved fish, and whenever we went out fishing on Lake Winnebago, we always took some fish to Grandma, because she didn't go fishing herself anymore, but she did love to have fish. And she and my grandfather lived in Neenah until they both passed away in the 1930s. Then my own mother passed away when I was just a child, as I said, in 1917. And my father remarried 2 years later. And the mother that I remember was Ethel Harris. It became Ethel Harris Mott. She was a high school teacher at Neenah High School in mathematics. She was also a graduate of Florence College, as was my father and his 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Florence Mott.
Do you recall much about your mother's life, for example, as a teacher in Neenah? Did you ever, what was it like did you ever talk about what it was like being a teacher in Neenah?
Not a great deal, except that, of course, the school system was much smaller, and she had a great deal of respect for Mr. Beeman, who was the superintendent of schools at the time. She was hired, and subsequently Mr. Hedges, who was superintendent of schools, the first one that I remember when I started elementary school. But other than that, I don't recall too much, although she did do a little tutoring at home. I remember the superintendent would call on her occasionally for students that needed some extra help in tutoring in mathematics, and she would help them in that. But after she took on a family of 4 children to raise, she didn't have much time to teach school.
Now, your father was a distinguished lawyer in Neenah.
Right.
And his name was?
Mayhew Mott.
Mayhew Mott. M-A-Y-H-E-W.
Y-H-E-W, right.
And when he went to Lawrence College, you said?
Yes, and he went to Lawrence College for 4 years, and when he graduated in, I think it was 1898, he went then as an apprentice into his father's law office and learned the profession, and subsequently passed the Bar Association exam, which was all it was required in those days to become an attorney. and he served as city attorney for several terms and also served as justice of the peace, a position which I guess no longer exists in local politics. But he served for many years on the prohibition ticket. He ran on the prohibition ticket.
That right?
Yes, there was.
He had strong feelings on that subject?
Very much so. And
do you recall any of those feelings?
well, there was never any drop of alcohol of any kind in our home, and he had no use for any of it. And Mr. Velty and he shared strong feelings on this same point. And other than that, he just felt that it was a no good thing to have around, and we were brought up in that kind of a home. In fact, there wasn't even a deck of cards in our house. We were strict Methodists.
Oh, like my mother.
Right.
I was going to ask you where it stemmed from. As soon as you said Methodist, I thought of my
Then
mother.
you know, and no dancing. We weren't allowed to dance either. And so when I went into nurses training at Theda Clark Hospital, which was just across the street from where we lived, the nurses' home then was on 2nd Street down near the river where the parking area is now. I had to learn to dance. I just insisted that the girls teach me how to dance. So they struggled with me and taught me how to dance, but I came from a very sheltered home.
What else do you remember about your father? What were some of his qualities? He had a 50-year law career here, is that
correct? Right. And he was a man of tolerance and patience, a soft-spoken man, but a man of strong principles. And I have very fond recollections of my father. He, at the time my mother died and the 4 of us were really very small, he was determined that he was going to keep us together. And there were aunts and uncles who would love to have adopted us, but he said no.
There
He
were
was
4
going
children?
4 of us, right, and the oldest was 5 years old. But he hired help to keep us together as a family, and ultimately remarried and got us a nice stepmother. But he was most interested in teaching, in having us learn literature. He was a great reader. In fact, he used to chide me because I didn't take time to read every day, and he saw to it that he allowed himself at least a half hour to an hour every day to read. And he wrote poetry. He was a member of the Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets, as was his sister, my Aunt Elizabeth Mott, who lived with us.
What would you say were some of the highlights of his legal career? Do you have any recollections of that? What area of law was he in, for example, or any outstanding aspects of his career that you'd like to remember?
I think his father, my grandfather, has had more of landmark cases, if you will, in his law career than my father did. In fact, my father chose not to be involved in criminal cases. He was more an authority on abstracts, on properties, on taxes, income taxes, and dealt with that rather than with the type of case which would require a plea, what do you call it, a trial lawyer. He kind of shied away from that.
What were some of your earliest recollections of life in Neenah?
Well, we were not a family that was involved socially in different activities other than the church. The church was the center of our family life, really.
Was it the Methodist Church?
The
or
Methodist
Presbyterian
Church.
that
The
you talked-
Methodist Church.
Could you describe the church? I mean, religious history is also very important. Where was it?
The church.
What type of activities did it have?
The Methodist Church is at where the present Methodist Church is now. It burned and was rebuilt there on the same spot. But I remember that we went to Sunday school at, I think, 9 o'clock, 9:15, and then church after that, and then home for dinner, and in the afternoon we were allowed to do certain things, but not play football, not play baseball, not do anything that might in any way seem to desecrate the Sabbath. And we often, in fact quite often, went Dad would put us in the rowboat and would row us across the river to Pine Street, and we'd walk over to see my grandmother and grandfather because they looked forward to seeing us on Sunday afternoon. Then we'd get back in time when we were old enough to go to Epworth League, which was the youth activity in the church.
And what was
Sunday.
that? What type of activities would they have?
Well, it was mainly social, and there were always some older persons, one or two college age or young married couples who were advisors to the group, so to speak. And but it was mainly a social group, and we interacted with some of the other Methodist Church young people in the immediate area, Appleton, Oconto, in the Methodist district, I believe they called it at that time.
Where were those activities held? Was there a center at the church?
Yes, there was a gymnasium called Wesley Hall, which burned at the same time that the church did, and their activities were there. These were perhaps basketball games, volleyball games, usually a worship service with it. There was also a summer church camp, and we would exchange. We would go to Seymour. We would take turns going from one community to another in the summer months, spring and summer and fall months. But they were really quite the highlights of our life because, as I said, there was no radio, there was no television.
What time period was this when you were engaged in the Methodist Church as a youth?
Well, let's see. I was born in
Approximately.
1913. This would have been in the 20s, mainly.
1920s?
Because I graduated from high school in 31, so it would have been during the period of the 20s. And
is there anything else about the Methodist Church? You're the first person that has brought up that church. I've heard about the Presbyterian Church a great deal, but nothing about the Methodist Church. Were there any outstanding ministers that you recall?
Yes.
Who held the church together in these days, would you say?
Pastor C.W. Haywood, Reverend C.W. Haywood, Heywood, was the first pastor that I remember, and then Ira Schlagenhoff after that.
How would you spell that last
Schlagenhauf. And he had a most kindly manner about him, and he related very well to young people, and he had a family of his own, and they were very well liked. And those two pastors, plus possibly Pastor Theodore Reykdal, Reykdal, are the pastors that I remember as a young person.
Was there anything about Pastor Reykdal that you recall?
He related very well also to the boys and girls in the Epworth League, and he had a son and daughter who were at that same age, or approximately that same age as my brothers and my sister and I. So we were involved together in a group, church group, young people's group, and that was our main social activity.
What were other young people doing in those days? I mean, in what sense did you feel, what were the other youth your age doing that you couldn't do?
We never were allowed to go to movies on Sunday. And we were occasionally...
Pretty much most of the congregation feel the same way?
Yes,
People
yes.
respond the same way?
Yes.
And what other things?
Skating. Well, we were allowed to go skating, this type of thing, and walking. Dad loved to take us on long walks. He was a great walker. In fact, when he was in Lawrence College, his family lived on 3rd Street over near the hospital, and he used to walk to classes at Lawrence. And his average time was about an hour and 35 minutes. Up the railroad right away, up under the Memorial Drive Bridge up to Main Hall. But one day he was late, and he said he made it in 55 minutes, which was his best time. But he used to take us on walks. He liked to involve us in what he felt was an excellent form of exercise. And this little newspaper clipping that I showed you that when he was interviewed when he was 82, he was still walking.
How big was the congregation at this time, would you say? Was it mostly Nina residents?
Yes, because transportation, of course, wasn't as readily available as it is now. And mainly Nina residents, a few Menasha, but mainly Nina. There was no Methodist church in Menasha, and there isn't even to this day.
Is there anything else that you can think of that would be interesting to an historian 40 years from now wanting to understand the Methodist Church of the 1920s? Is there any other features about it that should be recalled?
I think they have liberalized much of their thinking, many of the other churches have, and have realized that in order to keep the young people involved, they must move with the times.
And how would you give some examples of that?
Well,
How it's changed?
I'm trying to think of some of the things that young people do now. Our sons did, and sons and daughters of our contemporaries and those who have come after us are involved more in, for instance, there are more summer camps, a wider choice of summer camps to go to, and more discussion of down-to-earth problems as they pertain to youth, drugs and alcohol and promiscuous sex and so on, that words that weren't even used or spoken aloud in those days. They were just alluded to as things that you avoided. And now I feel that, I'm sure there are others of my generation who feel the same way, that unless you can relate to young people on the basis of their understanding of the problems and questions about the problems, you just don't reach them, and they seek out their own interests as they will. So I feel that the Methodist Church has moved along with many of the other Protestant churches in that same way, and in relating to young people on the basis of their needs and their should I say, open and frank discussions of problems that they meet every day with their peers.
What other things would you think, do you remember about 1920s or going to high school? What are some of your recollections of grade school or high school years that might be interesting to?
Well, I remember there were no school buses. We walked.
Where did you go to school?
I
didn't never ask you where you were living at the time.
We lived on Clark Street on the river, where you were familiar with where the hospital parking lot is. Those were all streets. We lived right there on the river, where there's a big gray stucco house still there. That was the house my father built. We lived there, and there was no Oak Street Bridge then. So that meant we walked all the way downtown across this bridge down to the Wisconsin Avenue, and then out, Kimberly High School, where the administration building is now, was the first high school. And the elementary school that we attended was Roosevelt. And at that time there were just the 3 elementary schools, as I recall: Roosevelt and Lincoln, which is no longer in existence. It's where Lincoln Manor is now on Isabella Street. It's an apartment house. And Washington School, which was the very first high school. It was the one my father graduated from. And that is now the first, or was called the First Ward School, but it's a different ward now. They've redesignated the wards. But we walked to school. It didn't matter what the weather was. And I remember there used to be the old bridge, before this bridge was replaced, was a bridge with iron, high iron, open structural steel. And when the winter was upon us, the city fathers would put up boards, large pieces of board siding, which would break the bitter wind that came off the river. And that was a little bit of protection as you walked across the bridge to school. And the same thing was true. We walked to church on Sunday. We had a car, but my father believed in exercise, so we all walked. And I used to be called sawdust legs because I was always the last one. I'd say, let's wait a little while when we were out for a Sunday afternoon walk. and the rest of them would be on ahead, and then they'd have to sit down and wait for me. So I got the name Sawdust Legs.
Do you recall anything about the schools or any particularly unique experiences in the grade school to high school?
We had some fantastic teachers at Roosevelt, and
Could you recall some of their names?
yes,
What was outstanding
I
about them?
could. I think that the first outstanding teacher that I remember was Elfrida Peterson, who was our 5th grade teacher.
Is that S-O-N, do you think, or S-E-N?
S-E-N. She was Danish also. She is no longer living. But she had a great ability to challenge students. And unfortunately, I say unfortunately because my brother, being a twin, we were in the same grade. And he and I were always aspiring to see who could get the best grades. And I think the teachers kind of went along with this because they were interested in seeing, too, which one could achieve a better grade. And she had a great way of challenging students, and she would always have parties when there was some special occasion. And we were told when we were in 3rd and 4th grade, you just wait till you get to 5th grade and have Miss Peterson. She's the best teacher. Then in the 6th grade, we had a teacher who was also no longer living, Marie Brandsmark.
Could you spell that?
Brandsmark, Marie Brandsmark. Her daughter is still living, Anna Hedges, and she's active in the Red Cross. But she was also an outstanding teacher. And then our 7th grade teacher was a Maud Dalber, D-O-L-B-E-A-R. For some reason, those 3 teachers stand out in my mind as being especially important in my elementary grades. And I think it was, with all of them, it was because they challenged us as students to read more books and write more book reports and get extra credit for doing this and that, which was many students aren't prone to do unless they are challenged.
How about high school years? What do you recall about those?
Well, there was the 4-year high school, which when I started was the Kimberly School, which is presently the administration building, and I went there.
What year did you graduate from?
1931, but I graduated from the present Shattuck School. It was then the Neenah Senior High School was built during those years, and I graduated in 31, and I majored in the science field because I was interested in going on into nursing, and there were some courses that were recommended for pre-nursing students. I think the really fun thing that I remember from high school were the operettas that our music teacher went to a great deal of work to put on, similar to what they do now in the way of musicals, only not nearly on as big a scale because we didn't have the student body nor the talent. But they were really fun to do. And
were you in any of those?
Yes. And the practicing was always fun. It was one way of getting out in the evening. But the bad thing about it was, as far as I was concerned, that I could never walk home with a boy or even another girl, because my father was always waiting for me with a car. So he was always sure that we got home on time and got home safely, but they were really fun times.
Are there any other vivid recollections of the high school? Is there any way that we could learn more about what the high school was like, or what it was like to be a high school student in those days?
Well, there wasn't the wide variety of extracurricular activities that there is now, but in 1930, the Neenah High School basketball team won its first state championship, and that was really a big year in Neenah, because then Ole Jurgensen was the coach, and that was a year to be remembered. And you probably have the score of that game, 28-5.
What was the reaction to that particular victory back in Neenah? Do you recall?
It was
any particular celebrations or any reactions in the school or anything?
It was extremely exciting, I remember. And I remember that the telegraph office was in touch with the game quarter by quarter, and the people stood outside the postal telegraph, wasn't it? Was called postal telegraph office down on Commercial Street, and waited for the scores to be posted at each quarter, because needless to say, there couldn't be as many people down at Madison. There just wasn't the transportation, and it was during the Depression years, and people just didn't go as much as they did do now. But it was a great victory and an exciting night. And then, of course, it wasn't until just a few years ago that Nina got another state championship. So our boys have heard about that for years.
Now, after high school, did you go right on to nursing school?
Yes.
At Theta Clark?
Yes, I graduated in June of 31 and entered nursing school in September.
Was that a 3-year program?
A 3-year program.
Could you describe some of the most important aspects of that nurse's training, or some of the highlights?
It was an extremely small school of nursing. It was only a 55-bed hospital at that time, and the student body numbered only 31, and that by very reason of its number would indicate that the students really got almost personal training and attention. And Mr. Aldridge to this day says that some of the best nurses that he had and has had, I think there's still two Theta Clark graduates still on the staff at the hospital, were some of the best nurses that he ever had, because they were trained so thoroughly and so completely in every detail, not only of bedside nursing, but of relating to the patients as individuals, which is something you don't see in a big hospital as a rule, but you do get it in a small hospital. But because the hospital only had 55 beds and didn't have the wide variety of clinical cases, we were required by state law to have 90 days of pediatric nursing, for instance. We had to go to Chicago, to Cook County Hospital, for 6 months. We spent 93 of those months, 90 days, in the children's hospital there to get the experience, clinical experience in nursing of children and babies, and a month in contagion, because there were no contagious wards at Theta Clark, and 2 months in psychiatric nursing.
Where did you go for that?
At the Cook County Hospital in Chicago, right. And our superintendent during those 3 years at Theta Clark was Jean Cruikshank.
How do you spell that?
Cruikshank. And she was from the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh, Scotland.
What was she like?
She was a very strict disciplinarian.
In what sense? Can you give me some examples?
She was determined that her students would be the very best nurses that could possibly be turned out. And she was a very demanding, in that she would settle for nothing less than the best. And she tried to get the very best instructor she could get for that reason. And I well remember how she used to stand. The 7 o'clock whistle would blow on the Nina Paper Company, and the students immediately had to stand up behind their chairs at the breakfast table. They were supposed to be all through eating by that time. And then she would say that portion of prayer from the Presbyterian book, Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid. And one morning I got in about 2 minutes to 7, and I was always late to breakfast because I didn't like to get up in the morning. And I was given my plate full with a piece of breakfast with a piece of French toast on, and I got about 2 bites in my mouth. And I always sat with my back to her so that I could chew all the while she was praying and make the most of my breakfast, because there wasn't one other thing to eat until noon. And she got partway through her prayer and she couldn't get any farther. She went back and she started again, and she did that 3 times. And she said, "I'm sorry, girls. You will have to excuse me. You may all go to work now. You may leave the dining room. Miss Mott, I want to see you," after they have left. And she scolded me. She said, if you don't get up earlier and eat your breakfast, you're going to get sick. You have got to get up earlier and eat a good breakfast before you go to work. So she used to stand there and she'd watch the girls as they went out of the dining room to see if their nurses' aprons were just 1 inch longer than their skirts. And believe me, if your skirt of your uniform hung out a little too far, or if you had a hole in your stocking, you got called out of line and sent back and had to make up the time on duty.
Where did the nurses live?
In the nurses' home, which was,
Where
originally the old nurses' home was a frame building on the corner of Lincoln Street and 2nd Street, directly across from the hospital, but that was torn down when the new hospital addition was built.
What was it like? What was it like living there? I mean, what were some of the
in the
rules
nursing
or
home?
whatever?
We had to be in at 10 o'clock at night. We had 8 hours of duty on the floors at the hospital, and perhaps 2 or 3 hours of class in a classroom at the nurses' home. And then in the evening we had 2 hours of supervised study from 7 to 9.
By supervised, what do you mean?
That meant we had to be in our rooms and studying, and no talking, and the doors had to be open so that the instructor could go up and down the hall and she knew we were studying. Then from 9 to 10 we were free, and at 10 o'clock we were expected to be in our rooms and be getting ready for bed.
Was there any social life of any sort?
Yes, and Mr. and Mrs. C.B. Clark were responsible for many of the social activities that were provided the student nurses, because we didn't have. We were
talking about training of nurses at Theta Clark Hospital, and we were talking. You started talking about social life and E.B. Clark.
Oh yes,
Mr.
Clark. You see, the hospital was originally built by Mr. Clark with an original endowment from Mr. Clark in memory of his sister Theta Clark Peters, and that I'm sure you've read in one of the books. But Mr. Clark was extremely civic-minded in that he felt that no one should ever be denied health care of any kind because of their inability to pay, and that was a standing rule at the hospital. No matter who came for care, they were cared for regardless of their financial situation. And it was always made clear to us that...
this was the position when you were studying nursing?
Yes, yes. And this was often difficult because, as I said, those were the Depression years, and there were many bills that were unpaid at the end of the year, and Mr. Clark always wrote the check that made up the difference between the deficit and the operating expenses. And so when it became... the hospital grew and became a more or less of a community hospital, necessarily that had to change. And of course he passed away quite suddenly from a heart attack when the year I was director of nurses there. That would have been 1948, I believe, about that.
What was the hospital? I'm not aware. Was it affiliated with a church originally?
No, it was a general hospital, and it was medical, surgical, obstetrical, but they didn't have any of the specialties, as I mentioned, in sufficient degree or sufficient quantity in clinical numbers to train the students. That's why we had to go to Chicago for 6 months of affiliation. But when we graduated, the Clarks always gave a very lovely graduation party and at the country club, and they really they were personally interested and involved in each nurse as an individual. And Mrs. Clark would send her chauffeur oftentimes over to take the students out to the swimming pool swimming, because she knew that they didn't have the transportation to get there. And they were just most gracious and kind. And as I said, the student body was small, but that lent itself more to becoming personally involved with the students.
Is there anything else that you think would be important about the years of nursing at Theta Clark?
We worked very hard.
What would be a typical day when you were study there?
Well,
Typical work day.
as I said, we had to be on duty at 7 in the morning, and in the first year, the first 4 months were always a probationary period. If you didn't pass your probationary period for one reason or another, you were not capped at the end of that 4 months. But all through the first and second years, we had a heavy load of classes, 7 to 8 hours of duty on the floors, 3 hours of class, supervised study in the evening, and supposedly 8 hours of sleep. But and this went on for 3 years, 6 months, of course, of it being in Chicago. But the work that we did was, what should I say, so much of it now has been replaced by the present nurses' aides, taking of temperatures and making of beds and cleaning of units. That is when a patient is discharged and the unit has to be cleaned in preparation for a new admission. We did all of those things, and as students, now they realize that doesn't have to be done by a nurse. It can be done by an unskilled person.
Let me follow this up a little more. How has nursing in your experience in Nina from the early 1930s to today changed?
It's changed quite considerably, not only in the technical things that nurses are expected to know. For instance, if I were to go back and to do clinical nursing in a hospital, I would have to take an extensive refresher course. I would need to become acquainted with many of the newer mechanical devices, if you will. Now, most everything is disposable. Hyposyringes, thermometers, everything. And in those days, they were washed and sterilized and used over again. Linens are disposable now. In those days, they were washed and ironed and folded and put back on the shelves and used. Also, there are fewer registered nurses now in the hospitals, and more of the licensed practical nurses, more of the nurses' aides and nursing assistants. And there are more programs for the nursing assistants than there ever have been in the past. But the registered nurse now, the whole effort of the American Nurses Association is toward the degreed nurse, which means a Bachelor of Science in Nursing. And just yesterday I read in the RN magazine that went over my desk that by 1985 the American Nurses Association has taken a definite stand that all nurses going into nurses training, all students going into nurses training will be expected to complete their training with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing degree.
How has administration of hospitals changed since the 1930s?
Quite considerably. In the first place, when I was a student, the superintendent of nurses was also the administrator of the hospital, which put a tremendous burden on one person. She was responsible for the student body, for the care of the patients, for the meeting the state standards such as they were at that time, which was strict enough. But now nursing administration or hospital administration is done by many times by men who have gone on to school to learn the business of hospital administration, which is strict. It definitely has a business side. In those years, somehow the administration was secondary to the nursing care, and yet as students, I know that the administration details were there, but there was a bookkeeper in the office, and there was a billing clerk, and there was a receptionist who gave out tickets or passes to the patients' rooms. But now it's so much more complex in that they have an administrator, an assistant administrator, and all the rest of the positions in the business office, which were non-existent at that time.
Now, apparently then from, I think you told me over the phone, from 1935 to 1935 to 1945, you were away from Nina.
Pretty much of the time.
Okay. Now, we talked off the tape that I told you I didn't really want to get into that in too much detail without offending you or anything, because I wanted to bring it back to Nina Menashe as quickly as possible.
Right.
Let me ask you the other major area, and one of the major reasons why I came to interview you, and that was because your work in the area of mentally retarded.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me how you got started in this field? You mentioned about your son off the tape,
Right.
and would you start right from the beginning of how you got involved in the mentally retarded in Nina?
All right. In 1956, when our youngest son was to be registered for kindergarten in September, I realized by that time that he had not developed at the normal rate, because I'd had 2 sons prior to him, and I could, by comparison, realize that his development was slow, and he didn't.
What's his name?
His name is Robert.
Robert.
And he didn't sit up as soon as he should have, and he didn't walk when he should have, and his speech was not as developed as it should have been for 4 years of age. So I knew that he was not ready for kindergarten. So rather than struggle any longer trying to find out what the problem was, and I couldn't find it out from our local pediatrician, he kept assuring me that there was nothing wrong, that Bob was just slow. I asked him if he would make an appointment for me with a pediatrician in Madison at the University Hospital, which he was glad to do. So we went down in August and to the University Hospital was in Madison, and Dr.
This
Harry.
is 1957.
1956.
56. Okay.
Yeah, 56.
And you went down to Madison.
And we went to Madison, and he was examined by Dr. Harry Weissman. Now, the Weissman, and he was a specialist then in the area of mental retardation, and he has since passed away, and the Weissman Research Center has been named in his honor, because he was really the pioneer in this state.
How do you spell his name?
Weissman, Harry Weissman. And he examined Bob, and gave him quite a thorough examination, and his conclusion was that he was functioning at the level of about a 2.5-year-old, and that he would probably achieve not beyond a 4th or 5th grade academic level. And I came away thinking, well, that's not so bad. I can live with that. I tried to think of what the other boys were at 4th and 5th grade and what I was. And while it was a blow when it came, I had known in my heart all along that something was wrong, but I didn't even know what mentally retarded was. I knew what the word retarded meant, that it slowed down. If you retard your engine, you slow it down. But when it came to dealing with a person who was mentally retarded, I was a real novice at it. So I came back and inquired then of our elementary supervisor in this public schools what was available for the retarded child, age 4, and was advised that there was nothing available at that time. Then I'm not just sure how I became acquainted with Mary Elizabeth Liebel, who was a mother of another retarded child who was a few years older. Jim Liebel is 3 or 4 years older than Bob.
Mm-hmm.
But she was then in the process of developing or inquiring as to what facilities could be made available for retarded children in Menashe. Found out from the State Bureau of Public Instruction, Bureau of Handicapped Children, that there was a law, a permissive law, which said whenever 5 children in any community could be found that were determined to be of the trainable level, that is an IQ of 35 to 50, that a class could be provided for them, but it was not a mandatory law. So she, in her own way, found out where there were 4 other children, and also found a minister's wife, Mrs. John Hanchett of the Congregational Church in Menashe.
How do you spell her name?
Hanchett, who was very much interested. She herself was an elementary teacher, but was interested in teaching the mentally handicapped.
Now, excuse me, what was being done at the time? Anything?
Nothing
So
for the
what
trainable
what
level.
would a mentally retarded person be doing at this time?
Staying at home.
Staying at home.
There was just nothing for them.
There was nothing in the whole community.
There were classes for the educable child who was in the IQ range of 50 to 75 or 80. There were classes in existence then, but nothing for a child below that, below 50. And of course the IQ level was the whole criteria of measurement. And now they know that there has to be, the child has to be evaluated from the whole child standpoint, that is his social capabilities as well as his articulation in his speech and his academic learning and so on. But at any rate, to go back to 1956, the first classes then were held in the basement of the Congregational Church in Menasha. Mrs. John Hanchett was the teacher. The summer prior to her starting classes, we were given a grant of money. I believe it was about $250 from the Kimberly Clark Foundation to send her to Southern Colony for 6 weeks for training to supplement her elementary school training. And on the basis of that, she was hired for what little money we were able to get. And Mrs. Liebel wrote 125 letters herself, typed them out, mailed them to people asking for money to help to get this class started.
How successful was that?
Extremely successful, enough so that we had sufficient funds to hire her for 3 half-days. And subsequently, sufficient funds were raised by selling candy, selling magazine subscriptions. The parent group grew slowly, but as it became known that there was a parent group and that there would be classes for these children, it was surprising how many parents came forward that might otherwise never have said a word. They tended to be more withdrawn and embarrassed, if you will, about the fact that they had a child that could not attend regular classes. But much of the success of the growth of the parent group has to do with the person-to-person relationship between one parent and another parent who needs help. And this was a big part of the growth of the parent group, which is the Neenah Menasha Association for Retarded Citizens.
Was there any particular leader involved in this? Were you one of the leaders of this parent group?
I think I can say I was, yes.
Then what happened? What were some other important developments, would you say?
It's a very wonderful community to live in because over the years in developing new programs for the handicapped, whenever you could demonstrate a real need and go to persons who could be of help in any way at all, there was always help available. And I have yet to experience somebody saying, that's not worth the time or the money or the effort. It's been a very rewarding 22 years of working and developing programs for the mentally handicapped, and that's one of the big reasons, because there are always people who are willing to say, yes, I like what you're doing. I think it's great that you're helping these children that would not otherwise have help, and I would like to do this, or I would like to give this, or I can't give any money, but I can give time as a volunteer. And it's been, as I said, a most rewarding effort for that reason.
Has there been any particular person in the community who was not directly involved in mentally retarded, or maybe not have a child who's mentally retarded, who was the most helpful? Was there anybody out in the community who was the most helpful, even though they weren't maybe in the inner circle or whatever? A community leader of some sort who was interested in the problem.
I don't know that I could say that there was any one person.
So in general, it was just in general community support.
Really. Once it became known that there was an organization like this to serve retarded children, and that it was a non-profit group and that persons could contribute to it, and this was a charitable gift, that I'm not implying that we didn't have to work, because we did. It's been an ongoing effort. but the state was right there behind us, and soon legislation was introduced through the efforts of the State Association for Retarded. At that time it was for retarded children, but it's now retarded citizens because, of course, it includes all age groups.
Let me just summarize now. You started the educational program with 5 children.
Right.
And you found a place for it and a teacher, and you started some fundraising.
Right.
And you started the parents group.
Right.
Then what happened? What was the next stage in growth? What type of, for example, what type of programs did you start to expand?
And the next thing was to convince the school system that it was their responsibility, and this is where the Bureau of Handicapped Children, which is a sub-bureau of the Department of Public Instruction, came into the picture. The law then became mandatory that there must be a class.
What year was that law made, you know?
I'm
Approximately.
Approximately 1960.
All right, go ahead.
59 or 60, and but it was up to the community to find a room, find a teacher, and to provide the type of instruction that these children needed. Now, that was only a half day, however, so our association felt that these children were entitled to a full day of school. So when the public school picked up a half day, then we supplemented that with the half day additional education under Mrs. Hanchett, and subsequently, that as the class grew, had to be divided. We had to hire another teacher. We were at St. Paul's Church across the way here. We were at St. Timothy's Lutheran Church in Menasha for a while. We were at St. Pat's Church in Menasha, scattered all around, but until the time came when the state said these children are now to be educated at public expense for a full day.
When did that change take place, approximately?
I'm having a little trouble here with dates. Let's see, Bob started in 1957 at age 5. Here again in the early 60s. I'm
1964.
It was the early 60s, and but we still had to. The parents were the watchdogs. The parents were the organization that had to see to it that the children got to school, and we weren't happy with the first teacher that was hired, and we went to the Board of Education and said, if we can't have a teacher in the public school that's as good as the one that we've got in our daycare class that supplements the public school, then we would like you to find a different teacher. She was a teacher that was teaching half days in Oshkosh and the other half day in Neenah. And we were successful in persuading them that she was not of the caliber that should be teaching retarded children.
She wasn't trained, or
she was trained, but she did not have the personal rapport with the children. She disciplined them in such a way that they didn't want to go back to school, and we visited school a few times and saw some of the things that she did, and then we compared them with what we saw in our daycare classes that we had established, and felt that she was not the kind of teacher we wanted. So that's when we went to the Board of Education and asked that they reconsider hiring her, which they did, and the Board of Education was most cooperative right from the beginning. There were a few members who were not as interested as others, but
which board members, if you recall, were the most interested?
Marian was one of the greatest.
How do you spell her name?
Tollettee. I remember very well what she said at that school board meeting. She said, if we're going to do anything for these kids, let's do it the right way and the very best way we can. And I could have gotten up and hugged her when she said it.
Approximately at that time, how many students were in this program at that? There were 5 to begin with. How many by 1964, would you say, when you started full-time classes? 20, 30, 40, 50?
I'd say at least 20. I can look up some of this material.
That's all right.
Because I do have it, but I just don't have it in my head.
That's okay. Then what happened? So approximately 1964,
Well, by
you
that
have the full day of
by that
classes.
time they were in school full days, and concurrent with this, we felt that these children needed some kind of a summer recreation program. All our brothers and sisters could go to the playgrounds, could go to the parks, could go to the pools, and these kids were home from June until September. And many of them regressed during that time because there was nothing structured in the way of social activities or school. So our first summer program was funded by a gift from the Menasha Kiwanis Club. And we had this in Menasha Park, and of course there were rainy days and there were good days, and the papers would blow around, and we didn't have a place where we could have the program on days when the weather wasn't good.
What would be the program? What would be a sample of it? What would you do?
It was Mrs. Hanchett ran the summer program too, and it was a less structured program in that it was less academic work and more fun. Outside games and physical activities that would involve exercise and games and going to the zoo in Oshkosh and going to down to the lake along the shore and occasionally going out to a farm and seeing farm animals and learning to identify different types of animals. But it was more of a fun type of program, and the setting was more fun-oriented. And this was a 6 weeks program, and we've had a 6 weeks program ever since. And now it's...
Approximately when did the summer program start?
About 1958. It was
So
one
that
of the...
was early.
Yes, yes. And about that same time, Mrs. Hanchett and her husband saw the need for a social recreation program for some of the older children, the teenagers. And so they started this on Friday nights in the basement of the church, and they would have games and light refreshments. And that continues to this day, only now it's a much bigger organization, and it's called the Leisure Time Program.
Is there any other chronological development that would be important then?
Yes, we started summer camp in 1970. I guess I know because I've been camp nurse for 9 years, and every year I say one more year, and my husband will say, no, 70, because 70 and 1978 was the 9th year, and
where is that?
Camp Onaway. It's the boys Camp Onaway. It's an island that's owned by the Boys Brigade Association, and we have 1 week of camp, and we have up to 60 campers from age 10 with no upper age limit. And this started in 1970. It's worked out very well, and every year we look forward to another year of camp. Also, about 1972, we realized that there were some boys and girls, older retired citizens, whose parents were either becoming older, in some cases widowed or widowers, and that we had to start thinking about group homes for these people to live in. And at that time, the state association was encouraging local associations or county associations to think in terms of establishing group homes for this purpose. So the residential care for the developmentally disabled was a county organization that was organized, and I served on that board. In fact, I'm still on that board, and we now have the 6 homes with a new federal grant for 2 new homes, one in Neenah and one in Oshkosh. Now, I passed over something which was quite important, which I should go back to. In 1961, we realized that we had to look forward to the time when these people would need a sheltered workshop, a place to work during the day, those that could be gainfully employed. And we didn't have the slightest idea how to go about doing this. So we asked for help from the state, and they suggested a man from Milwaukee who was in charge of the Jewish Vocational Service down there. He came up, and it took 1 year of study and preparation by this group of board members for work adjustment services to become established, and we started out with 6 clients in an old butcher shop on Main Street in Menasha, 216 Main Street, Menasha. There were 3 associations, each put in $3,000. The Oshkosh Group, which is the Winnebago County Association, the Neenah Menasha Association for Retired Citizens, and the Winnebago County Mental Health Association. And each had 2 clients. We tried to make it even. And we started out with a little project of soap powder, filling little bags with samples of soap powder, a new product that was being introduced in the area. Work Adjustment Services has grown now so that it has 2 new buildings, one on Breezewood Lane in Neenah, one on Furneaux Avenue in Oshkosh. We serve over 200 clients, Winnebago County clients, each day, and that's where our son Robert goes to work every morning and comes back at 3:30 every afternoon. It works Monday through Friday, and these persons would otherwise just simply not be employed, but they're employed at subcontract work, which is made available from local industry and is procured by the subcontract procurement man on the staff at Work Adjustment Services. And Bob, for instance, brings home a check of about $14 to $15 every 2 weeks. To him, money doesn't mean a great deal, but to many of them it does. And many of them are able to endorse their own checks, cash their own checks, put some in the bank, buy their own personal needs, and feel like self-supporting citizens. And most of them are recipients of Social Security and SSI because, of course, they're disabled adults. But they are productive, and they're doing meaningful work. And this is probably, well, Bob would go to work Saturdays and Sundays if the bus came on Saturdays and Sundays. He loves it. He's with his friends and busy.
How did the organizational structure emerge? Like you mentioned, the Winnebago County Mental Health Association. Was that in existence in 1957?
That was in existence about that same time, and the Winnebago County Association was established first. They were incorporated.
But they apparently didn't have any programs for the mentally retarded at that time?
No. 1953, Oshkosh got started, and their programs at that time involved a scholarship fund. Special education teachers were very hard to find then, so they started out by establishing a scholarship fund to encourage students to go into special ed. They also had a library, but our main thrust in 1956 was to establish classes for these children that they had nothing.
Was this
So
a Neenah Menasha project?
This was a local chapter,
or was
right?
It just Neenah?
Neenah Menasha. At that time, the state constitution for the Association for Retired Citizens said that there could be only one chapter in a county, and Oshkosh had established itself first as the Winnebago County Association. So we chose, rather than to do nothing, to organize as a local chapter, which we did. So there were the Neenah Menasha Association. We're still a local chapter, however, we're now a part of the state because that constitution was rewritten to include more than one chapter in a county.
Has the state helped in this regard? Some people are unhappy with the state bureaucracy or state interference in local affairs. Now, from your perspective in the area of mental health, has the state helped, or
it's been
has it bureaucratized the problem?
It's been a tremendous help, because back in the years when we had just the